They say betrayal never announces itself. It doesn't kick down the door. It slips in wearing a lab coat, speaking in the calm, clinical cadence of a man who has never once in his life been told no. I learned that on a Thursday afternoon in October, standing in a hallway that smelled like eucalyptus and money, 3 months pregnant with twins, listening to my husband negotiate the terms of my death like it was a line item in a quarterly report. My name is Elena Marsh. At the time, my legal name was Elena Ashford, though I would come to think of that name the way you think of a coat that never fit. Something I wore because it was expected, not because it was mine. I was 34 years old, a director of clinical strategy at a mid-sized health tech company outside Boston, and I was married to Julian Ashford, the only son of Charles and Margaret Ashford, whose family had spent 3 generations building one of the most quietly powerful pharmaceutical fortunes on the East Coast. Ashford Biosciences didn't advertise. It didn't need to. Its name was on hospital wings, on research chairs at 3 Ivy League universities, on a wing of the very fertility clinic where I now stood frozen outside a half-closed door. I'd gone back for my scarf. That was the only reason I was still in that hallway at all. My appointment had ended 20 minutes earlier, a routine growth scan, both babies measuring perfectly, 2 strong heartbeats thudding away on the monitor like a promise. Julian had stayed behind to speak with Dr. Whitfield about scheduling, he'd said, kissing my temple and telling me to wait in the car, that he'd be 5 minutes. I'd left my scarf draped over the chair in the exam room. I came back for it, that's all. I came back for a piece of cashmere, and what I found instead was the architecture of my own murder. The door to Dr. Whitfield's private consultation room, not the exam room, the office at the end of the corridor reserved for what the clinic called sensitive conversations, was open, maybe 4 inches. Enough for a strip of light to fall across the carpet. Enough for me to hear every word. I don't know why I stopped. I've asked myself that 100 times since. Some animal part of me, some part that had been quietly cataloging small wrongnesses for weeks without telling the rest of me, recognized my husband's tone before my conscious mind did. It was the voice he used with vendors who'd underdelivered. Not cruel exactly, worse than cruel. Patient. Understand the sensitivity, Dr. Whitfield, but I need you to speak plainly. No hedging. Mr. Ashford, I want to be very careful here, because what I'm about to tell you carries real weight. Dr. Whitfield's voice, usually so smooth it felt upholstered, had a thin, strained edge to it. The twins both carry a paired recessive marker on the same allele cluster we flagged in the expanded panel. Individually, it's nothing, completely benign for them, for their whole lives. But in a twin pregnancy, when there's a shared placental circulation, that marker can act as a trigger. It signals the mother's immune system to treat elements of fetal tissue as a threat. We're talking about a cascading autoimmune response, Elena's body essentially declaring war on itself. The floor didn't tilt so much as disappear. I put a hand flat against the wall. In English, Julian said. In English, if this activates in the 3rd trimester, and the data suggests it will given the marker load we're seeing, Elena is at serious risk. Organ involvement, stroke. In the worst cases, maternal mortality climbs sharply after week 30. This isn't a maybe, Julian. This is a documented pathway we've now seen in 11 prior cases. I remember pressing my knuckles against my mouth. I remember thinking, absurdly, of the onesie I'd bought that morning. Yellow, with a small embroidered fox, still in its tissue paper in a bag on the back seat of the car. And the fix, Julian said. Not how do we treat it, not is she okay. The fix, like he was asking about a server outage. There's an experimental targeted intervention, a monoclonal therapy that essentially masks the marker from Elena's immune system before the shared circulation phase intensifies. It's administered in a series of infusions starting around week 20. Success rate in trials is above 93% for the mother. Zero additional risk to the twins. I've already spoken to the research team. Given the family's relationship with the foundation, we could have her enrolled within the week. A pause. I could hear it stretching. Could hear the particular silence of a man doing math. What's the cost? The therapy itself, plus monitoring, plus the compounding, you're looking at just under $1.8 million. It's highly specialized. The manufacturing alone, don't, Julian said. Quiet. Final. Don't put a number like that in her chart, and don't let her hear a word of this. The hallway around me seemed to sharpen into an almost unbearable clarity in that instant. The particular dove gray of the carpet, the faint hum of the building's climate system, a watercolor print of a lighthouse hanging slightly crooked on the wall beside me, some small, useless detail my mind seized on because it couldn't yet process the larger one. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should straighten the frame. I remember thinking that the eucalyptus diffuser somewhere down the hall smelled suddenly like something closer to formaldehyde. The body does strange, disproportionate things with shock. It reaches for whatever is smallest and most fixable in a room because the actual thing cannot yet be held. I have relived that sentence more times than I can count, and it still lands the same way it did the first time, like a hand closing around my throat. Don't let her hear a word of this. Not, we'll figure it out. Not, whatever it costs. Don't let her hear. Dr. Whitfield's voice cracked slightly. Julian, I have a legal and ethical obligation to disclose material risk to my patient. This isn't optional. I could lose my license. Your obligation is to the person paying for this clinic's entire cardiac genomics wing, Julian said, and his voice had gone colder, quieter, the way it did right before he ended a business relationship. Which is me, which has been my family for 11 years. Elena is under enormous stress already. This pregnancy is high risk enough without handing her a death sentence to sit with for 6 months. We'll monitor her. Standard supportive care. If something changes, we reassess. Supportive care is not a treatment for this condition. It's triage. You'd be gambling with her life to avoid a number on a spreadsheet. My wife is stronger than you're giving her credit for, Julian said. And something in the way he said stronger made my skin crawl. Because it didn't sound like love. It sounded like an actuarial assumption. We'll trust her body. Now, the file. I want her records to reflect a standard risk twin pregnancy. Any notation of this marker, this theoretical treatment, gets removed from the shared chart. Keep a separate file, encrypted, accessible to you and me only. Are we clear? I heard paper shift, a pen click. Julian, I cannot, in good conscience, falsify a patient record. Your conscience, Julian said, and I could hear him smiling, is currently housed in a research wing my mother funded, the genomics lab you've been trying to get board approval for since March. Consider this a condition of that approval moving forward. I'm not asking you to lie to Elena forever. I'm asking you to let me manage the timing. There's a difference. Silence. Then, so quiet I almost missed it, Dr. Whitfield said, "And what exactly are you managing toward?" I shouldn't have needed to hear the answer. I already knew, on some cellular level, that I needed to walk away, get in my car, and think. But I didn't move. I stood in that hallway with my hand pressed to a wall that suddenly felt like the only solid thing left in the world. and I listened to my husband explain, in the same measured voice he used to walk investors through a pitch deck, the shape of the trap I had been living inside for months without knowing it. The Ashford Trust releases the controlling share of the foundation and the voting block in Ashford Bio to the next generation, only under specific conditions, he said. My father structured it that way after my grandfather's estate turned into a 5-year legal circus. The release requires, among other things, a direct male heir reaching majority, or, in the event of my death or incapacity before that, a clean transfer scenario. It's designed to prevent exactly the kind of drawn-out contest that happened with my aunt's estate. I don't see what that has to do with... Elena has founder's equity in her own name. 14% of Meridian Health, which is about to file for an IPO that values the company north of $2 billion. Under our prenup, in the event of divorce, that's protected, hers, fully. But in the event of her death, as her spouse and the father of her children, it reverts. Combined with the trust vesting on the birth of a male heir, a pause, and I could hear him choosing the next words with the same care he'd choose a font for a slide. It resolves a lot of complexity, cleanly. Grief is a powerful narrative, Dr. Whitfield. A young widower, twins to raise alone, a wife lost to a rare condition no one could have predicted. That's not a tragedy the market punishes. That's a story that generates goodwill, stability. It clears a path that would otherwise take a decade of shareholder fights to clear. I have read, since, that shock has a taste. Metallic, like biting foil. I tasted it then, standing in that hallway, one hand on my stomach in a gesture so old and so instinctive, it felt like it belonged to some ancestor of mine rather than to me. He was talking about my death as a narrative device. A liquidity event with a eulogy attached. And the other matter, Dr. Whitfield said, and now he sounded ill, genuinely ill, like a man watching something he couldn't stop. Julian. Renata is 14 weeks along. You had her tested at Weston Fertility under a different name. It's a boy. The silence that followed was the worst sound I have ever heard in my life. Worse than any scream, because in that silence, I understood that everything, the yellow onesie, the ultrasound photos taped to the refrigerator, the way Julian had cried, actually cried, the day we found out it was twins, none of it had ever meant what I thought it meant. I was not the center of this story. I was an obstacle with a due date. So you see the shape of it, Julian said quietly. Elena carries twins who complicate the equity picture and put her at real medical risk, regardless of what we do. Renata carries a clean, uncomplicated pregnancy and a male heir who satisfies the trust on his own with none of the legal entanglement. Whatever happens with Elena's condition happens or it doesn't. That's biology, not me. All I need from you, doctor, is discretion. Manage the timeline. Keep the file clean. That's all I'm asking. I didn't wait to hear Dr. Whitfield's answer. I don't know, to this day, whether he gave one, or whether he simply stood there the way I imagine a man stands when he realizes he has already agreed to something he can't undo. I backed away from that door one silent step at a time, the way you back away from a dog that hasn't noticed you yet. My product manager brain, the part of me trained for exactly 9 years to stay calm inside a crisis, already overriding the part of me that wanted to scream. Do not cry. Do not vomit. Do not let them hear your shoes on the tile. I retrieved my scarf from the exam room with hands that didn't shake. Not yet. and told the receptionist I'd gotten turned around looking for the restroom, and walked out through the clinic's tasteful glass doors into a bright, ordinary October afternoon, and got into the passenger seat of my own car, because Julian had the keys. And I sat there with my hands folded over the small, hard curve of my stomach and did not fall apart. Not yet. I had exactly 4 minutes before he would walk out that door smiling, asking if I was ready for lunch, and I intended to still be sitting there smiling back when he did. But that confrontation, the one where I finally let him see what I knew, didn't happen for another 5 months. What happened instead was quieter and colder, and took a great deal longer to build than 5 minutes in a parked car. To understand how I got from that hallway to where I ended up, you have to go back further. You have to understand how a woman like me, sharp, credentialed, financially independent, the kind of woman who runs product launches worth hundreds of millions of dollars, ends up standing outside a door, listening to her own death get discussed like a footnote. Let me rewind. Let me show you exactly how the trap was built. One gracious, generous, loving gesture at a time. 8 months earlier, I was standing in the bathroom of the house Julian and I had bought together in Weston, a craftsman with good bones and a garden I'd spent 2 years coaxing into something worth photographing, holding a plastic stick with 2 pink lines on it, and forgetting, for the first time in my adult life, every word I knew. "Say that again?" Julian said. He was behind me, a towel around his waist, hair still wet from the shower, and his reflection in the mirror had gone very still. There are 2 lines," I said. "I think that means—" I didn't get to finish. He let out a sound I had genuinely never heard him make in 6 years together. An undignified, joyful whoop. The kind of noise you'd expect from a man watching his team win a championship, not from Julian Ashford, who once described his own wedding as a well-executed event. He picked me up off the ground, careful even in his excitement, spun me once, and set me down like I was made of something breakable and precious. "We need a doctor to confirm it," I said, laughing despite myself, my voice unsteady. "But yes, I think we are." The weeks that followed were, I want to be honest about this, some of the happiest of my life. That matters to the story because it makes what came later so much worse, and because I think it's important for any woman reading this who's ever doubted her own instincts to understand that you can love someone with your whole chest and still be married to someone who is quietly calculating your value in a spreadsheet. Those 2 things are not mutually exclusive. That's what makes it so hard to see. The official confirmation came a week later. The first ultrasound came 2 weeks after that, a grainy black and white smear that the technician traced with a wand while I held Julian's hand so tightly I left marks. "There's a strong heartbeat here," the tech said, smiling. "Nice and steady. Let's just take a look around." She paused, moved the wand. "Oh, hang on." "What?" Julian's grip on my hand tightened. "What is it?" The tech's smile widened into something delighted. "There's a second heartbeat! You 2 are having twins!" I remember the room tilting in the good way, the way a room tilts when joy is too large for it. Julian's eyes went bright and wet in a way I'd genuinely never seen. This composed, contained man who negotiated 8-figure term sheets without blinking, undone by 2 heartbeats on a screen. He kissed my forehead, then my mouth, right there with gel still on my stomach and the technician tactfully looking away. "Twins," he breathed. Of course you'd overachieve at this too." That night, we drove out to the Ashford family estate in Dover for what I understood would be a quiet dinner to share the news. It turned into something closer to a shareholder announcement. "Twins," Margaret Ashford said, setting down her wine glass with a small, precise click. She was a woman built from good posture and better bloodlines, the kind of beauty that had been maintained rather than aged into. "Charles, did you hear that? Twins!" My father-in-law looked up from the tablet he'd been scrolling through at the dinner table, a habit that had stopped surprising me somewhere around year 2, and a slow, satisfied smile spread across his face. "Well now, that improves the odds considerably." "Dad," Julian said, though he was smiling too, already pouring from a bottle of champagne that had appeared, as things always did in that house, without anyone visibly summoning it. "I'm simply saying," Charles went on, settling back in his chair with the air of a man discussing a favorable earnings call. "The trust structure was built around continuity, a direct line. 2 chances instead of 1 is good portfolio management. That's all I mean." I felt something small and cold move through me, the first of what would become a long, slow accumulation of small, cold things. My children were not yet the size of limes, and they were already being discussed in terms of odds. "We're thrilled for you both," Margaret said, and to her credit, in that moment I believed her. "Now, we'll need to get you set up properly. I'll send Nadia, she did wonders with the Hargrove pregnancy, and we should move your care to Beacon. Dr. Whitfield does the most advanced screening on the East Coast. With twins, you cannot be too careful." "My OB at Brigham and Women's is excellent, Margaret," I said, keeping my voice light. "I've been seeing her for years." "I'm sure she's perfectly competent for a standard case," Margaret said, in the particular tone she used when she considered a matter already settled. "But you're not carrying a standard case, darling. You're carrying our grandchildren. We simply want the best resources available, and we're fortunate enough to be able to provide them. Let us do this for you." Later, in the car, I brought it up. "Your parents. They're a lot, Julian." I felt Margaret basically informing me my pregnancy was being outsourced. He reached over and took my hand, brought it to his lips the way he'd done 1,000 times before, in a gesture that had once made me feel cherished, and now, in retrospect, I understand was also a kind of management. "I know how they are, but it makes them happy, and it takes some of the load off us. Let them handle the logistics. You focus on growing our babies. That's the only job that matters." It sounded reasonable. It sounded, God help me, generous. It would be months before I understood that every one of those gestures, the nutritionist, the driver, the new clinic, the new doctor, was not generosity. It was containment. They were building walls around me, one thoughtful gift at a time, and calling it love. And I was grateful, because I didn't yet know what the walls were for. The tedious details, as Julian called them, began almost immediately. Nadia, the nutritionist, arrived with a week of vacuum-sealed, tasteless meals designed by an algorithm that had apparently never met a spice. A driver named Marcus appeared to take me to and from work, ostensibly for safety, though I noticed within the first week that he reported my schedule to Margaret's assistant each evening, a detail I filed away without yet understanding its weight. And appointments began appearing on my calendar at Beacon Fertility and Genetics, under the care of the renowned Dr. Whitfield, whose name, I would learn, was etched into a wing of the very hospital his research had helped fund. Funded in large part by the Ashford family. The first appointment was a week after the Dover dinner. Beacon's waiting room looked less like a medical office and more like a boutique hotel lobby. Abstract art, filtered light, a silence so complete it felt purchased. Dr. Whitfield greeted us himself, a man in his late 50s with a soothing voice and eyes that missed nothing. though at the time I read that watchfulness as simple professional thoroughness. Elena, Julian, a pleasure. Charles and Margaret speak so highly of you both. He shook our hands warmly. We'll be running a comprehensive panel today, family histories, an expanded genetic screen. Some of what we test for here isn't standard at most clinics. The Ashford family has always believed in staying ahead of the science. Peace of mind is priceless. Julian, in full doting father mode, asked sharp, informed questions about zygosity and placental development, his hand resting protectively on the small of my back the entire visit. I remember thinking, watching him, that I had never loved him more than I did in that exam room. I want to be honest about that too, because it's the thing that made the eventual unraveling so brutal. It is one thing to discover a stranger was never who you thought. It is another thing entirely to discover the man holding your hand during an ultrasound was, at the very same moment, already running numbers on what your death would be worth. As we left the clinic that day, Julian's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and something, a flicker, barely there, crossed his face before he smoothed it away into his usual composure. Damn, work fire drill. I need to swing by the office. On a Saturday? You know how it is. He kissed my cheek, already half turned toward the door. Marcus will take you home. Order in, put your feet up. I'll be late, don't wait up. His smile was warm. His eyes, I noticed for the first time, were already somewhere else entirely. That night, alone in our very large, very quiet house, picking at a nutritionist-approved grain bowl that tasted like damp cardboard, the loneliness sat heavier on me than it ever had before. I did what I always did when I felt something I couldn't name. I opened my laptop and went looking for a problem I could actually solve. I logged into Meridian's internal systems to check on a product rollout. A habit, not paranoia, at least not yet. And out of some idle instinct, glanced at the access log for a shared financial modeling folder Julian and I both had permissions on from an old joint venture project. There was a recent login under Julian's credentials to a file he had no obvious reason to need. The file was titled LT_liquidity_scenarios_post-trigger. Trigger event. A strange clinical little phrase. A funding round? A board departure? I tried to open it. Password protected. I want to be clear that I did not, in that moment, think my husband was planning to let me die. That thought was not yet available to me. My mind simply didn't have a shelf built for it. What I felt instead was a small, persistent unease. The kind you feel when a piece of furniture has been moved 2 inches to the left, and you can't say why it bothers you, only that it does. I thought about the way Margaret had said, manage. The way Charles had said, improves the odds. The way Julian had so easily let his parents take over my prenatal care without asking me a single question about what I wanted. He's under pressure, I told myself. The board, the trust, his parents. It's a lot right now. I closed the laptop. I told myself the seed of doubt I just planted was nothing. It would be another 6 weeks before I understood it was, in fact, everything. To understand why I stayed silent as long as I did, why a woman who ran 9-figure product launches for a living didn't simply pack a bag the moment she suspected something was wrong, you have to understand how thoroughly I had already been absorbed into the Ashford orbit long before any of this began. It didn't happen with a single dramatic gesture. It happens the way most quiet erosions happen. Gradually, generously, and with my own enthusiastic participation. I met Julian at a fundraising gala for a children's hospital, of all places, both of us roped into attending by employers eager to be seen supporting the right causes. He found me by the dessert table, deep in an argument with myself about whether a second slice of tiramisu constituted a personality flaw, and made me laugh so hard within 4 minutes that I nearly choked on the first bite. He was, at 29, already being groomed as the heir apparent to Ashford Biosciences, though he wore that inheritance lightly in those early days, self-deprecating about it, almost embarrassed, the way wealthy people are sometimes, performatively embarrassed about their wealth, right up until the moment it becomes useful to stop pretending. We dated for 8 months before he introduced me to his parents, which I took, at the time, as evidence of how seriously he took the relationship, rather than what it likely also was, a careful vetting period, conducted entirely on his own terms, before he brought a variable into his family's orbit. The first dinner at the Dover estate was formal in a way that made my palms sweat through the appetizer course. Margaret asking questions that felt, in retrospect, less like curiosity and more like due diligence. My family's background, my education, my long-term professional trajectory, a phrase she used with a precision that should have told me more than it did at the time. "She's sharp," I heard Margaret tell Julian in the kitchen afterward, not realizing I was close enough to hear, in a tone that managed to sound like both a compliment and an assessment of an asset. Good instincts. That equity position of hers at Meridian isn't nothing either. I chose, that night and for years afterward, to hear that as approval rather than appraisal. I understand now that it was both, and that the difference between the two had simply never mattered to me before, because I had never before been in a relationship where the person I loved came bundled with an entire apparatus of family interest in exactly who I was and what I brought with me. Julian proposed on a trip to Kauai 18 months in, on a beach at sunset with a ring that had, I would learn much later, been reset from a stone that had belonged to his grandmother, a detail Margaret mentioned so often in the lead-up to the wedding that I eventually understood it wasn't sentiment so much as a subtle, recurring reminder of lineage, of the idea that I was being folded into something ongoing and larger than myself, something with rules that predated me and would outlast whatever I individually wanted. The wedding itself was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. 300 guests on the Dover lawn, under a tent strung with more lights than a small municipality. A band flown in from New Orleans, a dress I still can't quite believe I once wore without irony. I remember standing at the altar, looking at Julian's face, open, unguarded, genuinely moved, and thinking, with the total unguarded certainty of a 28-year-old in love, that I had found the exception. That whatever complicated, transactional undercurrents ran beneath families like his, ours would be different, because what we had was real. I still believe, even now, that some of what we had was real. That's the part that took the longest to make peace with. Not that I'd married a monster, exactly, but that I'd married a man capable of loving me sincerely in one register, while quietly, simultaneously, treating me as an asset to be managed in another. And that he likely never experienced those two things as being in conflict with each other, because he had been raised inside a family that had never taught him they were. The prenup, when it came up 6 weeks before the wedding, was presented to me by Charles's attorney with the brisk, apologetic efficiency of a man delivering bad news he'd delivered many times before. Standard protective language, he called it, and much of it was protecting Ashford Bio's ownership structure, protecting family trust assets from any future claim. I signed it without much resistance, in part because Dana, a different lawyer entirely then, a friend of a friend I'd hired for exactly one afternoon of review, had insisted on one addition of her own: full, unencumbered protection of any equity I held or would come to hold in my own name, regardless of the marriage's outcome. At the time, it felt like a formality. Years later, it would be the single clause that made everything else survivable. What none of us thought to negotiate, because none of us thought to imagine it, was a clause covering what happened if the marriage ended not in divorce, but in death. The early years were, in most of the ways that are supposed to matter, good ones. Julian was attentive, funny in the dry, understated way that had made me fall for him in the first place, proud of my career in a manner that never curdled into the competitiveness I'd seen sink other ambitious couples. We built a life that looked, from the outside, and often from the inside too, genuinely enviable. I want to hold on to the honesty of that, even now, even knowing everything I know, because I think it's important for anyone reading this who has ever wondered how a smart woman ends up blindsided by someone she loves, to understand that the blindsiding rarely comes from an absence of love. It comes from a presence of love layered directly on top of something else entirely, so seamlessly you can't always tell, in the moment, which one you're actually looking at. It was only after we started trying for a baby, 3 years into the marriage, both of us ready, both of us, I believed, equally invested, that I began to notice the family's interest in our life together take on a different, more insistent texture. Margaret's questions about timelines grew more frequent. Charles began, with increasing regularity, to mention the trust in conversations that had nothing ostensibly to do with it. At a 4th of July barbecue, apropos of nothing, he'd noted that the structure really does work best with clarity sooner rather than later. And I'd nodded along, assuming he meant something about estate planning in the abstract, some old man's habit of thinking out loud about mortality. I didn't ask what the trust actually required. That is, I think, the detail that haunts me most in hindsight. Not that I was deceived, but that the deception worked in part because I had simply never thought to ask a question that would have changed everything. Because it had genuinely never occurred to me that my own children's gender might be a contractual matter in a document I had never been shown. By the time I was 20 weeks along, my life had been quietly, comprehensively redecorated by people who had never once asked my opinion of the color scheme. Margaret arrived one Tuesday afternoon with a stack of architectural binders under her arm, the way other grandmothers might arrive with a casserole. "We're thinking the Whitmore property in Dover for the nursery wing," she announced, spreading floor plans across my own kitchen table as though it were a conference room she'd booked. "It has the right light, and the security perimeter is already excellent. Far better than this house." "We're not moving, Margaret," I said, trying to keep my voice pleasant. "We love this house. The twins can have the rooms down the hall." She gave me the particular smile she reserved for things she considered adorable but naive. "Sentiment is charming, darling, but practicality matters more. That hallway is far too long. What if there's an emergency in the night? The Whitmore property has a self-contained nursing suite and a fully equipped medical room adjoining the master. We've already started the renovation. It's not really up for discussion." I brought it up with Julian that night. He was in his study, frowning at a spreadsheet, tie loosened, a glass of scotch, sweating a ring onto a coaster he never used. The house thing. Yeah, Mom mentioned it." He didn't look up. "It's a solid asset, honestly. The appreciation on that property is absurd, and it is safer for the girls. Let's just go with it." "My pregnancy is not a real estate transaction, Julian." That got his attention. He swiveled his chair, and his face arranged itself into an expression I would come to recognize over the following months as his conflict management face. Patient, faintly wounded, designed to make me feel like the unreasonable one. Sa, come on, don't get worked up. They're trying to help. This is what they do. They solve problems with resources, and we're lucky to have them. Let them handle this. Once the babies are here and things settle with the trust, we'll have all the freedom in the world. We'll build that place on the Cape you've always wanted. Just, let's get through this part together, okay? It sounded so reasonable. It always did. That was, I understand now, the precise mechanism of it. Every individual request sounded generous, protective, even loving. And it was only in aggregate, only when you stepped back far enough to see the whole shape of it, that you could see I was being built a very beautiful, very expensive cage. I found out we were having girls at the 20-week anatomy scan. I cried, the good kind of crying, the kind that comes from somewhere ancient and undefended. Julian squeezed my hand and said all the right things, and it was another 3 months before I understood that somewhere behind his eyes, in that moment, a small mechanism of disappointment had quietly clicked into place. Because girls did not satisfy a trust clause written by his grandfather in 1987 to ensure a clear, direct male line of succession. I didn't know about that clause yet. I want to be honest about the order of things, because I think it matters. I did not go looking for reasons to distrust my husband. The evidence found me, in small pieces, long before I understood what it added up to. Work, through all of this, remained the one place I still felt entirely like myself, which is perhaps why it was also the place someone first noticed something was wrong before I was ready to admit it to anyone, including myself. My boss at Meridian, a sharp, generous woman named Corinne, who'd hired me 8 years earlier straight out of business school and had watched my whole career unfold since, pulled me aside after a product review that spring, ostensibly to discuss a roadmap slide, and instead simply looked at me for a long moment across her desk. "You've been somewhere else in every meeting for about 6 weeks," she said, not unkindly. "I don't need details. I've been married 30 years, and I've watched enough people go through hard patches to recognize the specific tired you're carrying. I just want you to know your job here isn't going anywhere, whatever's happening. Take what you need. Meridian will still be Meridian." I nearly told her everything, sitting in that office, the words rising up in my throat with a force that surprised me. The hallway, the therapy, the trust, all of it. I didn't, in the end. Not because I didn't trust her, but because some cold, careful part of my brain, the same part that would soon be helping Priya build forwarding rules and encrypted archives, understood that the fewer people who knew before I was ready to move, the smaller the risk of the wrong detail reaching the wrong ear. I told her instead, only, that the pregnancy was harder than I'd expected, and that the in-laws were a lot, which was true, if radically incomplete. "They usually are," Corinne said, with the particular dry sympathy of a woman who had clearly navigated her own version of difficult in-laws decades earlier. "For what it's worth, whatever they're doing to your confidence right now, don't let it follow you in here. You built 14% of this company from nothing. That's yours. No family, however old the money, gets to quietly talk you out of knowing that." I thought about that sentence more than she probably ever knew, in the months that followed, in the hallway outside Dr. Whitfield's office, in the kitchen with the old phone in my trembling hand, in the conference room on the 31st floor. That's yours. It became, in its own quiet way, one of the load-bearing beams of everything I built afterward. The understanding that whatever the Ashfords tried to manage about my life, my career, built with my own hands over 8 relentless years, remained entirely, unmanageably mine, and would still be there, waiting, however the rest of it turned out. There was a particular Sunday, around this same time, that I've come back to often since, because in retrospect it contains almost everything I needed to see, and somehow still didn't. Nadia, the nutritionist, had taken to showing up unannounced by then, ostensibly to check in on my macros, though I'd begun to suspect her visits doubled as informal reports back to Margaret on my general state, my mood, my energy, whether I seemed, in the family's preferred parlance, stable. That Sunday she arrived while I was eating a bowl of pasta I'd made myself, simple, buttered, entirely outside the meal plan, and her face did something complicated and disapproving that she quickly smoothed into professional neutrality. "I just worry," she said, settling uninvited onto a stool at my own kitchen island, "that with twins, your body doesn't have room for error. Margaret mentioned you'd been skipping the smoothies." "I've been eating, Nadia, just not always your smoothies." Of course. She smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll just note it in my check-in. For the file." The file. I remember that phrase landing strangely, a small burr I couldn't quite smooth away. What file? Who was it for? I didn't ask, because asking felt paranoid, and I had spent 6 years training myself out of paranoia in that house, telling myself over and over that a family this generous, this involved, could not simultaneously be a family working against me. I understand now that generosity and control can wear each other's clothes so convincingly that even the person living inside the arrangement can't always tell them apart. That night, once Nadia had gone, I brought it up with Julian, carefully, testing the water rather than accusing. "Does your mother keep some kind of file on me?" Nadia mentioned notes. He didn't look up from his phone right away, which I noticed, the way you notice a half-second too long before an answer that's meant to sound casual. "It's probably just her tracking your nutrition plan, compliance notes, that kind of thing. Standard for the concierge service." Concierge service that reports to your mother. He set the phone down, finally, and reached for my hand across the table, his thumb tracing slow circles over my knuckles in the gesture that had, for years, been enough on its own to dissolve any argument before it fully formed. "You're carrying our entire future in that stomach of yours." Is it really so strange that my family wants eyes on that? I know it feels invasive. I know it's a lot. But it comes from love, even when it's clumsy about showing it. I wanted so badly to believe that. I think some large, stubborn part of me did believe it, right up until the afternoon in the clinic hallway made belief impossible to sustain. But even before that, even in the ordinary texture of that Sunday evening, his thumb warm against my hand, his voice low and reasonable, some new, unfamiliar part of me noted, quietly, that he had answered a question about surveillance with a defense of surveillance, and had done it so smoothly I'd nearly missed that it wasn't actually an answer at all. I didn't push further that night. I told myself I was being oversensitive, hormonal, the exact language his mother would have used had she known what I was thinking. And I hated myself a little for how easily that language slotted into my own internal voice, how thoroughly I had absorbed the family's preferred explanation for any discomfort I raised. It would be another several weeks, the hallway outside Dr. Whitfield's office, the 2 lines of an ordinary October afternoon rearranging themselves into the architecture of a plan, before I understood that my discomfort had never been the problem. It had been the earliest, clearest signal I had, and I had spent months being carefully, lovingly taught to distrust it. The first real peace came at 22 weeks. Julian had been drinking more scotch than usual, stressed about an upcoming board vote at Ashford Bio. He'd left his personal phone charging on the kitchen island while he took a call in his study, his voice rising in the particular register he used with underperforming vendors. Unacceptable. Restructure the whole division if you have to. His new phone was locked behind Face ID and a passcode I'd never once tried to guess, because in 6 years of marriage, it had simply never occurred to me that I would need to. But beside it, plugged into an old speaker dock, was his previous phone, an outdated model he'd downgraded to a glorified iPod for the sound system months ago and never bothered to properly wipe or secure. It had a simple swipe lock. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I picked it up. My thumb left a damp print on the glass. I swiped. The home screen was a photo of the two of us on a hiking trip in the White Mountains, both laughing, sunburned, impossibly young. The stab of grief that went through me was so sharp and so physical, I nearly put the phone down and walked away from the whole idea. I didn't. I opened the settings instead. I was not, I should say, a hacker. I was a product strategist with a minor in information systems from a decade ago and an instinctive, professional understanding of how digital infrastructure worked, which turned out to be more than enough. Find My iPhone was still enabled. The device was still logged into his primary Apple account for backups, even though he no longer used it as his main phone. The kind of small carelessness that happens when a man has never once had to worry about being caught at anything. I had, at most, 3 or 4 minutes before he came looking for it. I went to the App Store, still logged in, and downloaded a well-reviewed, entirely legitimate device optimization app, one that requested broad storage and administrator permissions to function, and granted every single one, my fingers unsteady but precise. While it configured itself, I checked the iCloud backup settings. Cellular backup was still on. The old phone, forgotten as it was still quietly syncing contacts, notes, and messages to the cloud. "Sat, you seen my other phone?" Julian's voice, from the hallway, closer than I expected. I nearly dropped it. I force-quit the app, set the phone face down on the dock exactly where it had been, and had turned back to the sink, rinsing a glass that didn't need rinsing, by the time he walked into the kitchen. "Isn't it on the island?" I asked, my voice miraculously even. "Oh, yeah, there it is. Thought I'd lost it. Boards being a bunch of dinosaurs about the Q3 restructuring." He came up behind me, kissed the back of my neck. He smelled like scotch and exhaustion. "Taking a shower. Don't wait up." "Okay," I said softly and did not turn around because I was afraid of what my face might be doing. That night, once he was asleep beside me, breathing slow and even and utterly untroubled, I lay in the dark with my laptop and logged into the iCloud account tied to the old phone. I'd memorized the username from the settings screen in the 90 seconds I'd had. I tried a few obvious passwords, his mother's maiden name and his birth year. Rejected. The name of his childhood dog plus an exclamation point. Rejected. I thought about the password-protected note I'd glimpsed for half a second before he'd nearly caught me, a note titled simply, "Trust Provisions." What would a man who thought of his own inheritance as the organizing principle of his life use as a password? I typed, "Ashford, Mail, 2025. The dashboard unlocked. For a long moment, I just sat there, my own heartbeat loud in the silence, staring at the fact that I was, quite suddenly, inside my husband's private digital life. I didn't dive in recklessly. 9 years of product management had taught me at least that much, that the fastest way to get caught is to move too fast. I spent 20 minutes simply understanding the architecture. Photos, notes, old message threads, mostly dormant since this had stopped being his primary device. Mail, still syncing. I set up a quiet, private forwarding rule from a burner email account I created that night. Any message containing certain key terms, Whitfield, Beacon, therapy, trust, Renata, marker, Jean, would be silently copied to an inbox only I could access. It was a blunt instrument. It was also, I would learn, more than enough. Renata. I didn't know the name yet, not really. I'd seen it once, months earlier, in a calendar invite I'd assumed was work. An analyst on the strategy team Julian mentioned occasionally and unremarkably. I didn't think about her again until 3 days later, when the first forwarded email landed in my secret inbox. A receipt from a prenatal boutique addressed to Renata Cole, shipping to an apartment in Somerville. The order, placed 2 weeks earlier, included a gender reveal confetti cannon. Blue. I sat at my kitchen table with the California sun. No, the New England sun. Gray and thin through the window, feeling obscenely indifferent to what it was illuminating, and read that line over and over. Blue. It was real. All of it was real. And it had been real for a while. A week later, I watched, via the Find My app still quietly running on the old device, Julian's current phone travel south to Somerville after a tense board meeting. It stayed at an apartment complex for 2 hours and 17 minutes. When he came home, he smelled faintly of a different soap, something with sandalwood. His was cedar and bergamot. "Needed to clear my head," he said, kissing my cheek. "Drove out to the reservoir. Helped." "I'm glad," I said, and poured him a glass of water. And my hand did not shake. And I understood in that moment that I was becoming someone I didn't fully recognize, and that I was going to need to become her a great deal more before this was over. The pieces kept arriving, small and cold, one at a time. A mirrored calendar notification. Dinner, RC 7 o'clock, The Federalist. An hour later, a text preview, cut off after the first line. Dad says to keep it quiet until after the rest lost to the character limit of a notification banner, but the shape of it unmistakable. His parents knew. This wasn't an affair Julian was hiding from his family. This was a plan his family was helping him manage. There was a night, about 10 days into all of this, when I nearly lost everything before I'd even properly begun. I'd gotten careless, not with the old phone itself, which I'd learned to handle with something close to reverence, but with my own laptop, left open on the kitchen counter while I fed the twins in progress, a snack that was really just an excuse to stand up and stretch my aching back. Julian came in from a run, sweaty, reaching for the water pitcher, and his eyes landed for one long, terrible second on my screen. Still open to the encrypted inbox where the forwarded emails collected, a subject line visible in the preview pane. R.E. Beacon Fertility, Cole, R. I have never, before or since, moved that fast in my life. "Julian, can you grab I said, already stepping between him and the counter, closing the laptop with what I hoped read as ordinary, absent-minded tidiness rather than panic. "The prenatal vitamins. They're in the cabinet behind you. I keep forgetting where I put them." He turned, obligingly, to look in the cabinet, and by the time he turned back, the laptop was shut, and I was 3 feet away, running water into a glass I didn't need, my heart slamming so hard against my ribs I was genuinely afraid he'd be able to hear it in the quiet kitchen. "You okay?" he asked, handing me the vitamins. You look a little pale. Just tired, I said. Twins take it out of you, apparently. He kissed my forehead, entirely unsuspecting, and went to shower, and I stood alone in that kitchen afterward and shook so hard I had to sit down on the floor, my back against the cabinets, until my pulse slowed enough to trust my own legs again. I told Priya about it the next day, meeting her at a coffee shop 2 towns over under the thin pretext of a prenatal yoga class I'd signed up for and never actually attended. She listened, her expression unreadable, then set down her cup with a precision I would come to recognize as her version of alarm. "That's the moment I was worried about," she said. "Not the old phone. That's contained. It's a dead end if he finds it. He'll think you were being paranoid at worst. But your primary laptop, your day-to-day device, that's where you're vulnerable. Because that's where you're not thinking of yourself as someone hiding something. You need a second machine. Something that never touches your home network, never syncs to any account he could plausibly know about, that lives in a bag in your car or at my place, not in your house." She set me up with it that same week. An inexpensive laptop, purchased with cash, configured with an encrypted drive and a browser that left no trace on any shared network, that I began keeping in the trunk of my car alongside the notebook, retrieving it only when I was parked somewhere with no reason to be watched. It felt, at first, like an absurd overcorrection. The kind of precaution you'd expect from a spy novel rather than a pregnant product manager in the Boston suburbs. It felt that way right up until the second close call, 4 weeks later, when Julian mentioned, entirely casually over dinner, that IT had flagged some weird traffic on the home network the week before. Probably nothing, he said, a smart fridge acting up. But he'd had someone from Ashford Bio's security team take a look, just to be safe. I understood in that moment, with a clarity that felt like cold water down my spine, exactly how much resource and attention was quietly arrayed around the perimeter of my life, watching for exactly the kind of disturbance I was trying to create. It would have been easy in that moment to lose my nerve entirely, to close the laptop, delete the forwarding rules, tell myself I'd imagined the worst of what I'd overheard, go back to being the golden, oblivious wife I'd been playing for months. I thought about it. I want to be honest about that too. There was a version of that week where I nearly did exactly that. Told myself it was safer to simply not know, to trust that whatever Julian had been discussing in that hallway was some cold hypothetical he'd never actually act on. What stopped me, in the end, was not righteous anger. It was much simpler than that. I put my hand on my stomach one night, feeling one of the twins shift and roll beneath my ribs, and understood with total, uncomplicated certainty that I could not, would not, spend the rest of however long I had left wondering whether the man sleeping beside me was quietly waiting to see if I would save him the trouble of deciding. Some doubts you can live inside indefinitely. That one, I couldn't. I needed more than digital fragments scraped off an abandoned phone. I needed someone who understood how to build a case out of scattered evidence, someone who had spent a career doing exactly that. I thought of the one person I knew who made a living exposing exactly the kind of rot that hides behind old money and good manners. Marin Diaz and I had met 4 years earlier at a Women in Health Tech Summit in Cambridge, bonding over a shared, weary contempt for panel discussions that used the word disruption unironically. She was an investigative reporter for a well-regarded business publication, known for a string of stories that had quietly ended 2 executive careers and prompted an SEC inquiry into a wellness startup's cap table. We'd stayed in loose contact, the occasional comment on each other's posts, a coffee once a year that we always promised to make more regular and never did. I used a prepaid phone I bought with cash at a mall 40 minutes from home, sitting in the parking lot afterward for 20 minutes, composing and deleting the same 6 lines. Eventually, I sent, Marin, it's Elena Ashford. We met at the WHT summit in Cambridge. I have something you'll want to see. It involves the Ashford family. I need someone I can trust before I need someone who can publish. Can we talk, off the record, just as people first? She called the burner 40 minutes later. Elena Ashford, she said, no preamble. I've had a file open on your in-laws for 2 years and never had enough to make it stick. What have you got? We met 3 days after that, not in the city, at a diner in a town 45 minutes from anywhere either of us usually was. The kind of place that still had paper placemats and a pie case by the register. I brought printouts, the emails, the screenshots of the notification portal, a timeline I'd built in a notebook I kept in the trunk of my car rather than in the house, because by then I had stopped trusting even my own kitchen table. Marin read through everything twice, her expression sliding from professional interest into something harder, angrier, more personal, somewhere around the second page. This isn't a gossip story, she said finally, tapping the printout of the trust clause language I'd managed to piece together. Julian had, unwisely, once emailed a summary of it to himself years earlier, back when it was still an abstraction rather than a plan in motion, and it had sat dormant in an old thread until my forwarding rule caught a reply to it. This is attempted, Elena. Do you understand what this reads like? If they let a known high-risk condition go untreated deliberately and something happens to you, that's not negligence. Depending on what a prosecutor could show about intent, that's manslaughter at minimum, maybe worse. I know, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Do you have proof of the intent? Proof he knew and chose not to tell you? Not just that the condition exists? I didn't. Not yet. Everything I had was circumstantial. Real, damning, but circumstantial. What I'd overheard with my own ears in that hallway was the only piece of direct evidence that connected all of it, and I had no recording of it, nothing but my own memory and my own word against the combined, extraordinarily well-funded word of the Ashford family. I need to hear it happen again, I said slowly, understanding the shape of the plan even as I spoke it aloud for the first time. On the record. Recorded. I need Whitfield to say it to my face. Or I need to be in a room where Julian says it again, somewhere I can capture it cleanly. Marin studied me for a long moment. You're 24 weeks pregnant with twins whose lives may genuinely depend on getting that treatment approved. You understand that whatever you do next, you can't wait too long to actually get the therapy started. This isn't just about proving what they did. It's about keeping you and those girls alive. I know that better than anyone, I said, and I meant it with my whole chest. Then you need someone who can help you build the technical case properly. What you've done with that old phone is smart, but it's also legally messy, and half of it could get thrown out or get you in trouble for unauthorized access if this ever goes to court. You need someone who does this clean. She thought for a moment, then pulled out her own phone. I know someone. Priya Patel does security consulting, used to do digital forensics for the DA's office before she went private. She's discreet, and she owes me one very large favor. That was how the second Fury joined me, though we didn't call ourselves that yet. That name came later, half joke and half armor, something Marin coined over a bottle of wine the night we finally won. Priya was compact, precise, and entirely unimpressed by the Ashford name, which I would come to learn was exactly the quality I needed most in a room full of people who had spent their whole lives being deferred to. Here's the problem with what you've built, Priya told me, laying my notebook and printouts across her kitchen table 2 nights later. It's good instinct, terrible chain of custody. If this ever needs to hold up, in a courtroom, in a divorce proceeding, anywhere official, a decent lawyer tears it apart in about 4 minutes. We need something clean. Something that doesn't depend on you having illegally accessed his old phone. How? We build forward from here, not backward. You keep doing exactly what you've been doing, playing along, staying calm, not tipping your hand. Meanwhile, I set up something legitimate. A voice-activated recorder, properly disclosed under Massachusetts two-party consent law the second it needs to be, which means you tell them, later, when it matters, that you were recording, and everything before that point we treat as background intelligence, not evidence. We use what we already have to know where to be and when. We use what we build going forward to actually win. It was, I would come to understand over the following months, an entirely different kind of pregnancy than the one I'd imagined at the start. One lived on 2 tracks simultaneously. On the surface, doctor's appointments, nursery colors, the particular glow people insisted on commenting on in grocery store checkout lines. Underneath, a slow, patient, methodical construction of a case against my own husband, built one intercepted email and one recorded phone call at a time. While I smiled at his mother's binders and let his father call my daughters an improved portfolio outcome, and told absolutely no one in my life except 2 women I'd met a handful of times what was actually happening inside my house. The call from Beacon came at 26 weeks. We'd like you and Mr. Ashford to come in together to discuss the full results of your expanded genetic panel, the scheduler said, her voice bright and professional and utterly ordinary, as if she weren't calling to summon me to the exact appointment I had spent 5 weeks preparing for. I said yes. I hung up. I called Priya. "This is it," I told her. "This is the appointment." "Then we're ready," she said. "Elena, you don't have to go through with the confrontation piece today. If it doesn't feel right in the room, you walk out and we build the case another way. Don't force it." "I know," I said. But I also knew, standing in my kitchen with one hand on the small, hard swell of my stomach, that I was ready. I had been ready for weeks. I had simply been waiting for the room. The recorder was smaller than a stick of gum, sewn by Priya's own hand into the lining of the cardigan I wore that day, soft gray wool, the kind of unremarkable, comfortable thing a pregnant woman throws on without thinking. Voice-activated, 6 hours of storage, she'd told me the night before, showing me exactly where the seam sat against my ribs. You don't have to do anything, it just listens. I told Julian I'd forgotten something in the exam room and needed a minute, a lie so small and so plausible it barely registered as one. The same kind of lie I'd been telling for weeks now, each one a little easier than the last. He kissed my cheek, told me to take my time, and went ahead to Dr. Whitfield's private office to get things started, which was, I understood by then, code for the 2 of them speaking first, without me, exactly as they had 5 months earlier in a different hallway. This time I didn't stand frozen. This time I walked, deliberately, unhurried, to a spot in the corridor just outside the door, a spot Priya and I had mapped out from the clinic's public floor plan the week before. And I stood there with my hand on my belly and my heart slamming against my ribs, and I let the recorder do exactly what it was built to do. The therapy needs to start within the next 2 weeks if it's going to have any real effect before the 3rd trimester, Dr. Whitfield was saying. And his voice had a rawness to it now that hadn't been there 5 months earlier. The sound of a man who had spent 5 months being complicit in something he clearly hated. "Julian, I have to say this plainly. We are running out of runway. If we don't begin infusions now, the window closes, and we are looking at exactly the outcomes I described to you in October. I need you to authorize it. I told you, we're monitoring. Monitoring is not a treatment plan for a condition with this mortality profile. I have documented in writing my recommendation that this therapy begin immediately. If something happens to your wife in the 3rd trimester, Julian, that documentation exists. I will not be the only name on a file that reads like negligence. A long pause. When Julian spoke again, his voice had the particular flatness it got when he was recalculating. You're saying you want this on record now, after everything. I'm saying I have 2 daughters of my own, and I am done being your family's discretion, Dr. Whitfield said, and something in his voice broke, quietly, audibly. I have thought about nothing else for 5 months. I let you talk me into altering a chart. I told myself it was your decision to make about your own wife, that it wasn't my place, and every night since I have not been able to look at my own children without thinking about hers. I am authorizing the therapy today. You can fire me, you can pull your family's funding, you can do whatever you like, but I am not going to be the reason a woman dies of something we knew how to prevent. I stood absolutely still in that hallway, tears running freely down my face for the first time in 5 months, and I understood that I had just recorded, in a man's own trembling voice, both the confession and the redemption in the same conversation. You're overreacting, Julian said, but there was something different in his tone now. Not menace exactly, calculation shifting gears. Fine, authorize it. I never said I wanted her to die, Whitfield. For God's sake, what kind of monster do you think I am? I said manage the timeline. There's a difference between letting nature take its course and actively withholding a cure. Is there? Dr. Whitfield said quietly. Because from where I'm sitting, those look like the same thing wearing a different suit. I didn't wait to hear more. I walked, unhurried, back toward the waiting area, wiped my face in the reflection of a dark window, and by the time I sat down beside my husband 4 minutes later, my expression was perfectly composed, and inside my cardigan, 6 hours of storage was quietly, patiently doing its work. They called us in together not long after. Dr. Whitfield, to his credit, told me everything that day. The marker, the risk, the therapy, all of it laid out in plain, careful language. No mention of the encrypted file or the 5 months of silence, because I understood, watching his face, that he had decided this was the version of atonement available to him. Honesty from this point forward, even if he couldn't undo what had already been withheld. This is a lot to take in, Julian said, reaching for my hand, his voice thick with an entirely convincing tenderness. Sa, are you okay? I looked at him, really looked, for the first time in months, at the face I had loved for 6 years, searching for some sign of the man I'd married, some seam where the mask might show its edges. And I found nothing. He was extraordinary at this. He always had been. That, more than anything else, was the thing I had to sit with in the months that followed. Not just what he had done, but how completely, effortlessly well he had done it. I'm scared, I said, and it was, at least, entirely true. But I want to start the treatment right away. Of course, Julian said, squeezing my hand. Whatever you need, whatever it costs, I want you safe. Whatever it costs. I almost laughed. I didn't. That night, sitting in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store I had no memory of driving to, I finally let myself shake, Great, racking tremors that had nothing to do with the March chill outside. I cried until I ran out of tears, and then I sat in the silence that came after, and something in me settled into a cold, clarifying resolve I had never known I possessed. I looked at my own reflection in the rearview mirror, a woman 26 weeks pregnant, mascara tracked down both cheeks, eyes clearer than they'd been in months. "Okay," I whispered, to the mirror, to the two lives curled up beneath my ribs. Game on. The recording went to Priya that same night, encrypted, backed up in 3 places, none of which were anywhere in my own house. Marin listened to it twice, then a third time, sitting very still at her kitchen table. "This is it," she said finally. "This is the whole thing. Motive, means, intent. And now a doctor on record describing exactly what he was pressured to do and why. Elena, this isn't just a divorce case anymore. This is a story. And depending on what a prosecutor wants to do with it, it might be a criminal one too." "I don't want him in prison," I said, and I meant it, though it surprised me to hear myself say it. "I mean, some ugly part of me does. But mostly I want my daughter safe. I want what's mine protected. And I want the people who decided my life was a line item to understand, completely and permanently, that they were wrong about who they were dealing with." "Then you need one more thing," Marin said. "A lawyer who can turn all of this into leverage instead of just a story. Someone who understands trusts, corporate equity, the whole ugly architecture of old money. I know exactly who." Dana Okafor had built her entire practice around exactly this kind of case. Women with enormous assets on paper and almost no practical power, married into families whose lawyers had spent generations building structures designed to survive exactly this kind of reckoning. She listened to the recording once in total silence, in the safety of her own conference room with the blinds drawn, and when it finished, she folded her hands on the table and looked at me with an expression that was somehow both furious and delighted. Before Dana ever said those words, though, there was a stretch of about 10 days where Marin, on her own time and her own dime, did something that changed the entire shape of what we were building. She went looking for the pattern. "Families like this don't invent a playbook once," she told me, spreading a set of printouts across her own dining table late one night, the girls asleep in a travel crib in the next room because, by then, I trusted almost no one else to watch them. "They refine one, generation over generation, and they almost never think to hide the early drafts because the early drafts happened before anyone was watching closely enough to call it a pattern." What she'd found took my breath away. Julian's aunt, Charles's younger sister, a woman named Eleanor who I had met exactly twice in 6 years of marriage, always described vaguely as estranged, had, it turned out, spent 5 years in the early 90s contesting the very same trust structure after her own husband died suddenly during a contentious period in the family's original pharmaceutical patent litigation, in circumstances that a probate filing from 1994, buried in a county records archive Marin had spent 2 full days physically digging through, described as medically ambiguous and insufficiently investigated given the financial stakes involved. Eleanor had lost that fight, outspent, outlasted, eventually settling for a fraction of what she'd sought and disappearing from the family's public narrative entirely, her name scrubbed so thoroughly from subsequent Ashford press materials that I hadn't even known, until that night, that Julian had an aunt at all beyond the vague, unexplained absence I'd never thought to question. "I want to talk to her," I said, staring at a grainy photocopy of a 30-year-old filing, feeling something cold and furious settle in my chest. I already found her, Marin said. She's 71, lives outside Providence, and when I called her, carefully, as a journalist, not connected to you at first, she cried on the phone for 10 minutes before she could get a full sentence out. She's been waiting 30 years for someone to ask. I met Eleanor Ashford Klein 2 days later, in a modest, sunlit kitchen that looked nothing like anything I associated with the family name she'd once carried. And she held both my hands in hers for a long moment before either of us said anything at all. "You survived it," she said finally. "Whatever they tried. You're sitting here, which means you survived it." I never got that far. I didn't know to look for what they were doing until it was already done to my husband. And by then, all I had left to fight with was grief. And grief loses to lawyers every single time. She told me things that afternoon that reframed everything I thought I understood about the family I'd married into. That the trust's male heir provision hadn't originated with Julian's grandfather at all, as the family liked to claim, but had been quietly tightened in the exact aftermath of her own husband's death, worded more precisely specifically to prevent the kind of ambiguous contest she'd waged. That the language around clean transfer scenarios wasn't Julian's invention or even his father's. It was, near verbatim, a phrase that appeared in the trust's original 1987 drafting notes, which meant Julian had likely grown up hearing that exact cold, sanitized vocabulary discussed at family dinners, the same way other children hear grace said before a meal. "He didn't invent the monster," Eleanor said quietly. "He was raised inside its mouth. That doesn't excuse what he did. It might explain how he did it, without ever quite feeling, I suspect, like he was doing anything monstrous at all." I left her house that afternoon with a banker's box of 30-year-old documents and a version of grief I hadn't expected, not for myself, but for the woman across from me, and in some strange, complicated way, even for Julian, a boy who had apparently been taught before he could properly understand what he was learning, that love in his family came pre-negotiated, contingent, subject to review by a document older than either of us. It didn't change what I intended to do. If anything, it sharpened it, because I understood now that I wasn't only fighting for my own daughter's safety. I was fighting to be the last woman in that family's history who had to. Dana absorbed all of it in a single sitting, flipping through Eleanor's decades-old filings with the focused intensity of a surgeon reviewing a scan. "This is extraordinary," she said finally. "Not just for leverage, though God, it's extraordinary for leverage, but because it establishes pattern. A single incident is a tragedy, or an accusation. A documented pattern across 3 decades with consistent language, consistent structure, consistent outcome? That's not circumstance anymore. That's a system. And systems are exactly what courts and journalists both know how to take apart." "Elena," she said, "I need you to understand something. Most of my clients come to me after the fact, after they've already been pushed out, after the assets are already moved, after the narrative is already set. You came to me with a recorded confession, an 8-week head start, and full knowledge of both his affair and his trust structure. Do you understand what that means?" "Tell me." "It means we are not playing defense," Dana said. "We are choosing very precisely exactly when this detonates." Dana's plan was simple in concept and brutal in its patience. I would do nothing that tipped my hand until the twins were born and I was medically stable, because no leverage in the world was worth risking my own life or theirs, and because, as she put it, with a bluntness I came to treasure, a furious woman who moves too early hands them time to build a counter-narrative. A calm woman, who waits until she's holding all the cards, doesn't. So I waited. I want to describe what that waiting actually felt like, because I think people imagine it as some kind of cold, easy performance, and it was the opposite. It was the hardest acting I have ever done in my life. I sat across from Julian at dinner and asked about his day. I let Margaret walk me through nursery fabric swatches. I attended a baby shower thrown by his cousins at a club in Newton and smiled and opened gifts and thanked everyone by name in handwritten notes the following week, while 3 floors below, in a storage unit in Watertown that no one in the Ashford family knew existed, Priya kept a growing, meticulously organized archive of everything we had. The gene therapy began the following week. I sat through the first infusion with Julian holding my hand, and I let him, because some small, stubborn, exhausted part of me still needed the comfort, even while the rest of me was building a case against the hand doing the holding. Dr. Whitfield, true to the version of himself he'd apparently decided to become, was scrupulous and attentive at every subsequent visit, and once, only once, in a moment when Julian had stepped out to take a call, he looked at me with an expression of such naked guilt that I nearly told him everything, right there, in an exam room with monitors humming around us. "You know," he said instead, quietly, "if you ever needed a full, unaltered copy of your medical file, the real one, not the sanitized version, I would have no trouble providing that, whenever you asked." It was as close to an apology and an alliance as either of us could safely manage in that room, and I understood it for what it was. "Thank you," I said. "I may take you up on that." The third infusion did not go the way the first 2 had. I remember the room going strange around the edges, a tightening across my chest that felt, at first, like nothing more than the ordinary breathlessness of late pregnancy, and then, within minutes, like something else entirely, something that made the nurse's face change from routine attentiveness into a sharpness that frightened me more than any pain had. My blood pressure spiked, my vision narrowed at the edges into something soft and gray. I remember Dr. Whitfield's voice, unusually loud, calling for something I didn't catch the name of, and Julian's hand gripping mine so hard it left marks, and the particular, useless clarity of thinking, in the middle of it, of my daughters, of how unfinished everything still was. It passed, an early, atypical immune response to the therapy itself, Dr. Whitfield explained afterward, exhausted, his composure visibly rattled in a way I hadn't seen from him before, not even in October. Rare, but documented, manageable with adjustment, not dangerous in itself once caught early, which it had been. I spent 2 nights in observation. The twins, monitored continuously, never wavered. 2 strong, steady heartbeats, entirely undisturbed by the crisis unfolding 1 layer of tissue away from them. Julian did not leave my side for either of those 2 nights. I want to record that honestly, because it complicates the story in a way I've never fully known what to do with. He slept, when he slept at all, folded into an uncomfortable vinyl chair beside my bed, and woke each time a monitor beeped with a startled, genuine alarm that no amount of subsequent revelation has ever let me fully write off as performance. Somewhere in that hospital room, holding my hand while machines charted the fragile arithmetic of my own survival, I believe he was afraid of losing me. Not the version of losing me that resolved cleanly into a favorable trust outcome, but the plain, unbearable fact of it. I think both things were true of him simultaneously. The fear and the calculation, occupying the same body without ever quite looking at each other. It is, I've come to believe, the most honest and least comforting thing I can tell you about him. I need you to be okay, he said at 4 a.m. on the second night, his voice cracked and unguarded in a way I hadn't heard since our wedding vows. Sa, I need you to be okay. I looked at him in the dim, humming light of that hospital room, and some small, stubborn, exhausted part of me, the part that had loved him for 6 years and hadn't yet fully learned how to stop, wanted, badly, to believe that sentence contained nothing else. I let myself believe it, just for that one night, because I needed something to hold on to that wasn't fear, and because I understood, even then, that I would have the rest of my life to sort out which parts of him had been real. I was discharged on a Thursday, the adjusted therapy resuming without incident the following week, my body, finally, gradually, learning to tolerate the treatment that was quietly saving my life. It was during that recovery, home, exhausted, propped up in bed with my laptop while Julian was at the office, that I found the letter. A month later, going through the mail, a habit I'd kept even after Julian tried gently to route most correspondence through his assistant, I found a letter from the family's insurance broker, addressed to Julian, that had been misfiled into the household stack. A revised policy summary. My life insurance, taken out shortly after our wedding at a modest standard amount, had been quietly increased 18 months earlier. Not long, I noted with a chill, after the first conversation about trust provisions and male heirs must have started circulating among the family's lawyers, to a figure that made the room swim slightly when I first read it. The listed beneficiary was, unsurprisingly, Julian, in full. I photographed it, forwarded it to Dana, and put it back exactly where I'd found it. "This is good," Dana said when we spoke that night. Not good like I'm happy about it. Good like it closes the loop. Means, motive, a documented financial incentive that predates the affair becoming operational, and now a recorded confession describing exactly how they intended to benefit from your death being framed as tragic misfortune rather than negligence. Elena, I want to be honest with you. I've built cases on far less than this and won. What we have now isn't a fight, it's a formality. Then why does it still feel like a fight? I said. Because it is one, she said more gently. Just not the kind you're used to losing. I went into labor 6 days early, on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, standing in the kitchen of the Whitmore house, because in the end, exhausted by the endless negotiation of it, I had let Margaret have that particular battle, telling myself it was one square I could concede on a board where I intended to win the whole game. A sharp, unmistakable tightening low in my back sent me straight to the hospital. Julian driving with the particular white-knuckled focus that, to his credit, was entirely real. Whatever else was true about him, I do not believe, even now, that he wanted his daughters harmed. He wanted them delivered into a story that served him. Those are not, I've learned, mutually exclusive desires either. Labor progressed quickly at first, almost deceptively easily. The kind of pace that made the delivery nurse smile and mention cheerfully that I might beat most first-time twin mothers to the recovery room by hours. Then, somewhere around 8 centimeters, my blood pressure spiked without warning, sharp and sudden in exactly the pattern the marker had always threatened, and the room's whole temperature changed, nurses moving faster, a monitor's alarm cutting through the low murmur of encouragement that had filled the space a moment before. Dr. Whitfield himself paged in from another floor, arriving at a near run. "We've seen this exact profile before, in the trial data. he said low and fast to the attending physician, already reaching for a chart, his hands moving with a precision that had nothing performative left in it. The therapy's holding the primary risk down, but we need to watch for a secondary spike through delivery itself. It's documented, it's manageable, but we move now, not in 10 minutes. I remember Julian's face above me, gray with a fear that required no interpretation at all. And I remember gripping his hand hard enough that I heard him make a small, involuntary sound of pain and not letting go anyway. Because in that moment, whatever else was true, he was the only other person in the room who had loved these two lives from the very first blurred ultrasound image, and some primal, uncomplicated part of me needed that shared terror more than I needed my own carefully built distance from him. "Talk to me," I said to Dr. Whitfield, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. "Tell me the truth. All of it." "The truth," he said, meeting my eyes directly, "is that 5 months ago, this moment might have killed you. Today, because of the therapy we started in March, your body has a fighting chance nobody would have given you back in October. I need you to trust that. And I need you to push when I tell you to push, and nowhere else. Can you do that?" I could. Genevieve arrived first. At 6:52 in the evening, a furious, red-faced, 6-pound bundle of outrage at the whole business of being born. And the room exhaled with her, the sharpest edge of the crisis passing with it. Isla followed 4 minutes later, quieter, watchful, her eyes finding mine almost immediately in a way that undid something in my chest that I don't think will ever fully be put back together. My blood pressure, monitored obsessively for the next several hours, settled, slowly, back into something ordinary. Both girls were healthy. Both of them were, against every terrible odds their father had once weighed so coldly, perfectly, extraordinarily fine. And so, against odds that had once been quietly calculated as an acceptable loss in someone else's spreadsheet, was I. Dr. Whitfield came to check on me himself the next morning, before his rounds officially started, and stood at the foot of my bed for a long moment without saying anything at all. "I need you to know," he said finally, "that I think about October every single day. I will for the rest of my career. I let a family's money buy 5 months of silence I can never get back. And there is no version of yesterday's outcome that undoes that, whatever way it turned out. I'm not asking you to tell me it's fine. I just needed you to hear me say it out loud, once, to your face, while you were both actually safe." "It's not fine," I told him honestly. "But you got in that room in October and you told the truth eventually. And you told it again 5 months later when it mattered even more. And you've spent every appointment since making sure my daughters and I got the best care this hospital could give us. I don't think forgiveness is a single door you walk through. I think it's something you keep choosing, appointment by appointment, the way you did. So thank you for choosing it." He nodded, something in his shoulders loosening for what looked like the first time in 9 months, and left me alone with my daughters in the pale, ordinary light of a Wednesday morning, both of them finally, entirely, safely here. I would like to tell you that in that room, holding my daughters for the first time, I forgot everything I knew about their father. I didn't. If anything, holding them made it sharper, a fierce, uncomplicated clarity about exactly what I would and would not allow to happen to them, exactly what kind of world I intended to build around them, and exactly how far I was willing to go to make sure it was one they controlled, rather than one that was managed on their behalf by people who thought of them as an improved portfolio outcome. Margaret arrived at the hospital within the hour, already discussing christening dates. Charles sent flowers with a card that read, in his own hand, "Well done," the line continues. As though I had completed a quarterly deliverable, rather than survived a labor his son's family had known for 9 months carried real risk of killing me. I smiled. I thanked them. I held my daughters and thought, with a calm that surprised even me, 4 more weeks. I need 4 more weeks to heal, to be steady on my feet, to be sure the girls are thriving. And then this ends on my terms, not theirs. My own mother arrived the next morning, having driven 3 hours from the small Connecticut town I'd grown up in, a town with none of Dover's manicured hedges or curated legacy. And the first thing she did, before even looking properly at her new granddaughters, was look at my face for a long moment and say, quietly, "Something's wrong. Tell me." I hadn't planned to tell her. Hadn't planned to tell anyone in my own family, in fact, out of some instinct I'd never fully examined to protect them from a world of lawyers and trust clauses that felt entirely foreign to the modest, steady life they'd built. But something in her voice, and the particular unguarded exhaustion of new motherhood layered over 9 months of secrecy, broke something open in me. And I told her, quietly, in a hospital room with my daughters asleep in their bassinets, the whole terrible shape of it, the hallway, the recording, the trust, all of it, in a rush that left me shaking by the end. My mother, who had spent 30 years as a school nurse and had, I think, seen every possible shade of what families are capable of doing to each other, did not gasp, did not perform shock. She simply took my hand, the way she had when I was small and frightened of thunderstorms, and said, "Okay, what do you need from me?" Not what do you need me to feel? What do you need me to do? It was, I realized in that moment, exactly the question no one in the Ashford family had ever once asked me in 6 years of marriage. Not what impression should we manage, not what does this mean for the family name, simply, plainly, what do you need? I cried harder in that hospital bed than I had at any point in the preceding 9 months, and my mother sat with me through all of it, saying nothing, simply present, the way she always had been, in a way I had somehow let myself forget I could still lean on. "Your father's going to want to drive up and say something extremely unwise to that man," she said eventually, when the worst of it had passed, and there was enough dry humor back in her voice that I found myself laughing despite everything. "I'll talk him out of it, mostly. But Elena, I want you to hear this from me, plainly, because I don't think anyone in that family has ever said it to you honestly. You do not owe anyone in that world your silence, your patience, or your forgiveness on any timeline but your own. You built your whole life once already, out of nothing they gave you. You can build it again." She stayed for a week, sleeping in a rented cot beside my hospital bed, and then, once we moved into the rental house, on the pull-out sofa in the living room, doing the unglamorous, essential work of new grandmother labor, laundry, formula runs, the 2 a.m. shift when I finally, gratefully, let someone else hold the exhaustion for a few hours. And it was in that ordinary, unremarkable domestic rhythm, so different from anything Dover had ever offered me, that I found the steadiest ground I'd stood on in nearly a year. The morning I left the Whitmore house for the last time, I did it quietly, on a Tuesday, while Julian was at a board meeting he had no idea would be his last as the presumptive golden heir of anything, with Priya's rented moving van idling in the driveway, and my mother inside with the girls, keeping their morning as ordinary and undisturbed as two 6-week-olds' mornings could be made to feel. I hadn't planned to feel anything about the leaving itself, I'd told myself, for weeks, that the house had never really been mine in any way that mattered, that Margaret's binders and Margaret's contractors and Margaret's non-negotiable opinion about hallway length had made sure of that from the very beginning. But standing in the nursery I hadn't chosen the color of, looking at a crib I hadn't picked out, I found myself unexpectedly still for a long moment, running my hand along the rail, thinking about all the nights I'd sat in that exact spot, nursing one twin or the other in the dark, telling myself stories about a future that had already, unbeknownst to me, been quietly priced against my own life. I took almost nothing that belonged to the house itself. Not the furniture, not the art Margaret had selected, not even most of the clothes that had been chosen for me by a stylist Victoria had hired without asking in the early months, back when I'd still mistaken that kind of curation for kindness. I took the girls' things, the handful of items I'd bought myself without any family input at all, my grandmother's ring, and a single framed photograph from the mantel. Not the professional family portrait Margaret had commissioned for the holiday card, but a candid one, taken on our honeymoon by a stranger on a beach in Kauai, of Julian and me laughing at something neither of us could probably remember anymore. Young and unguarded and, at least in that one frozen second, entirely real. I almost left that photo behind, too. Priya found me standing in front of it, hesitating, and said nothing, simply waited, the way she learned to wait through a dozen smaller versions of this same hesitation over the preceding months. I don't know why I want it, I admitted. You don't have to know why, she said. You're allowed to keep the true parts of something, even after you've had to leave the rest of it behind. That's not weakness. That's just honesty about what actually happened to you. I took the photograph. It sits now in a drawer rather than on display. Not hidden exactly, just put away. The way you put away a coat for a season you're not currently in. Available if I ever want to look at it again. Evidence of something that was, for a while, entirely genuine. Layered underneath something that very much was not. The drive to the rental house took 40 minutes. I didn't look back at the Whitmore estate in the rearview mirror even once. Not out of any dramatic act of will, but simply because, by the time Priya pulled out of that long, manicured driveway for the last time, my attention had already, entirely and gratefully, moved on to the two small, furious voices in the back seat demanding to be fed. The 4 weeks passed in the strange, suspended fog of new motherhood layered over quiet preparation. Dana filed for divorce on a Thursday morning in late July, timed with a precision that felt almost surgical, to land exactly 1 hour before a scheduled call with Ashford Bio's outside counsel regarding an unrelated matter, ensuring the news would reach Charles Ashford's desk at the worst possible moment for damage control. The filing included a request for an emergency protective order regarding custody arrangements, citing credible evidence of a documented plan involving deliberate medical endangerment of the petitioner during a high-risk pregnancy. Language chosen, Dana told me with something close to relish, to be impossible to walk back or spin as a garden-variety divorce. I was not in the house when the papers were served. I was, by then, 3 towns away, in a rented house Priya had helped me secure under an LLC that led nowhere near my name. With my daughters asleep in a nursery I had picked out and painted myself, in a color no one but me had chosen. Julian called 41 times in 6 hours. I let everyone go to voicemail. The 42nd call, I answered, on Dana's advice, with her sitting beside me and the recorder, a real one now, disclosed, legal, sitting openly on the table between us, running. Elena. His voice was raw in a way I had genuinely never heard before, not even in our worst arguments. "Where are the girls? What is this? What emergency order, Elena? Talk to me, please. Whatever this is, we can fix it." "I know about the trust clause, Julian," I said, and I kept my voice level, the way I would in any high-stakes negotiation, because that was, in the end, exactly what this was. "I know about Renata. I know about the insurance policy. And I have a recording, clean, legal, admissible, of Dr. Whitfield describing exactly what you asked him to do to my medical file and why." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. "You've known," he said finally, very quietly. "How long?" "Since the appointment in October," I said. "The first one. I came back for a scarf." I heard something in his breath break. Not performance, I don't think. Not entirely. Some genuine collapse of a man realizing the woman he'd spent months managing had, in fact, been managing him back, more patiently and more thoroughly than he had ever managed anyone in his life. "Elena, I never wanted you to actually. I would never have let it get that far. I was going to get you the treatment eventually. I just needed time to..." "To what?" I said. "To see if nature solved your inheritance problem for you first?" He didn't answer. There was nothing, really, to say. "Here's what happens now," I said, and I could feel Dana's steady presence beside me, could feel Priya and Marin somewhere in the background of my own resolve, even though neither of them was in the room. "You are going to sit down with your lawyers and mine, and we are going to negotiate this like adults, or I am going to hand everything I have, the recording, the insurance documents, the trust language, all of it, to a reporter who has been building a file on your family for 2 years, and let the public decide what to make of the Ashford name after that. Your choice." Marin, through a source she'd cultivated inside Ashford Bio's communications department over the 2 years she'd spent quietly building her file, got word of what happened in the building that afternoon within hours. Charles had been mid-presentation to the board's audit committee when his assistant interrupted, against explicit standing instructions never to interrupt that particular meeting, to hand him a folded note. He'd read it, gone visibly pale in front of 11 board members, and left the room without explanation. The first time, according to Marin's source, that anyone at the company could remember Charles Ashford abandoning a board presentation mid-sentence in over a decade running the firm. By 6 that evening, according to the same source, outside counsel had been summoned to the Dover estate, and Margaret had canceled a scheduled charity gala appearance with no explanation given, an absence noted, apparently, in the society pages of a local paper the following week under a headline speculating about her health. I felt, reading that speculation later, an emotion I hadn't expected and wasn't entirely proud of. A small, sharp satisfaction at watching the family that had spent months quietly managing every detail of my life suddenly find itself, for the first time, entirely unable to manage the story unfolding around them. Julian's 42 calls that afternoon, I later learned from Dana, were only the visible half of the crisis. He had also, within the first hour of being served, called his father twice and his mother once, all 3 calls going straight to voicemail. The family's carefully maintained hierarchy in which Julian had always deferred instantly and completely to Charles's judgment, apparently offering him nothing in the one moment he most needed it. He had, according to a message he left on my own voicemail before I finally picked up on the 40-second call, spent that first hour entirely alone with what he'd done. No family apparatus available to help him manage the fallout, for what might have been the first time in his adult life. I won't pretend that detail didn't move something in me, even then, even furious. There is a particular complicated grief in watching someone you loved discover, all at once, the true weight and true limits of the safety net he'd always assumed would catch him, and understanding, in the same moment, that you are the reason it finally didn't. The 3 weeks between the filing and the negotiation were, in their own way, harder than anything that had come before, because for the first time since October, I wasn't performing calm for an audience. I was simply, privately, terrified, in the way that only becomes possible once the adrenaline of the fight itself briefly recedes and leaves you alone with the size of what you've done. I moved through those weeks in a strange, suspended state, caring for 2 newborns on almost no sleep, while somewhere in the background lawyers I'd never met exchanged letters about the value of my marriage, my safety, my children's future. Priya installed a security system at the rental house that would have embarrassed a small embassy. Cameras, motion sensors, a panic button wired directly to a private security firm she trusted, on the theory, which I did not argue with, that a family capable of discussing my death as a matter of trust optimization could not be assumed incapable of escalation once cornered. Marin checked in every evening, not for updates, just to ask how I was, how the girls were sleeping, whether I'd eaten. Small, unglamorous kindnesses that meant more to me in that stretch than almost anything else. Dana ran me through the negotiation itself so many times I could have recited both sides of it in my sleep, wargaming every objection Charles's attorneys might raise, every attempt Margaret might make to reframe the story into something smaller and more forgivable. They're going to try 3 things, Dana told me the night before, sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad covered in her small, decisive handwriting. First, minimize. Make it sound like a misunderstanding, an overreaction, grief and hormones, God forbid. Second, threaten. Remind you how much money and reputation they have. Imply this could get ugly and expensive for you too if it drags on. Third, and this is the one to watch for, appeal, Julian, probably. Trying to reach the part of you that still loves him, because some part of you probably still does. And that's not a weakness, Elena. That's just true, and they will try to use it. Your job isn't to feel nothing. Your job is to know, going in, exactly which of your terms are load-bearing and which ones you're willing to let them feel like they won on, so the real ones hold. And if they don't take the deal at all? Dana looked at me for a long moment. Then we go to court, and it gets uglier and slower and more public than either of us wants. But Elena, I want you to understand something, because I don't think you fully do yet. You are not the desperate party in that room. You have not needed anything from them in months. They need this deal far more than you do, because the alternative for them is a recorded confession in open court and a reporter with 2 years of file already built. Walk in there like you already know that. Because you do. The 4 of us, Dana, Priya, Marin, and I, held what Marin insisted on calling the war room session 2 nights before the negotiation, spread across my kitchen table with takeout containers going cold between stacks of documents, timelines, and a whiteboard Priya had produced from somewhere, with a diagram mapping out every likely countermove the Ashford legal team might attempt. Custody first, Dana said, tapping the whiteboard. That's the piece we don't compromise on structurally, even if we let them feel like they've won small concessions around the edges, supervised visitation windows, holiday scheduling, that kind of thing. The load-bearing wall is full physical and legal custody vested in you, with any Ashford involvement explicitly subordinate to your discretion and subject to periodic review. If they push hard on anything, they'll push hardest here, because access to those girls is the only leverage they have left to imagine they might eventually claw back. They'll also push on confidentiality, Priya added. Try to get the recording sealed under terms broad enough that it effectively muzzles Marin's reporting too, not just the direct disclosure. Watch for language that tries to fold related parties or associated reporting into the NDA. That's a poison pill dressed up as boilerplate. Already flagged it, Dana said. I've drafted 3 versions of the confidentiality clause depending on how aggressive they get. Elena, I want you comfortable with all 3 before we walk in, because I may need you to read the room and tell me which one to reach for in real time. We went through it for nearly 4 hours that night. Every clause, every likely objection, every worst-case branch of the conversation mapped out with the same rigor I'd once brought to product launches worth hundreds of millions of dollars, except the product this time was my own family's safety, and the stakes had never once, in 9 years of a demanding career, felt remotely this high. Somewhere around midnight, Marin looked up from the pile of papers and laughed, a little helplessly. "We should have a name," she said, "for this. Us. Whatever this has become." "The Furies," Priya said immediately, not even looking up from her own notes. "Goddesses of vengeance, who show up specifically for people the rest of the world decided weren't worth protecting." Feels accurate. It stuck. Half joke and half something more sincere than any of us wanted to say out loud that night. A name for the strange, fierce, entirely unplanned sisterhood that had assembled itself around a stolen phone and a burner text message, and that would, in 3 days, walk into a conference room on the 31st floor and calmly, precisely, take apart the architecture of a family that had never once imagined it could be taken apart at all. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat in the nursery for a long time after the girls finally settled, watching them breathe in the dim glow of a nightlight shaped like a moon. And I thought about the woman I'd been a year earlier. Competent, ambitious, entirely unprepared for the idea that the architecture of her own marriage might need to be dismantled and rebuilt from a folding chair in a strange house with a panic button on the wall. I did not recognize her anymore, that earlier woman. I wasn't sure, some nights, whether I mourned her or simply understood, finally, that she'd needed to go. The negotiation took place 3 weeks later, in a conference room on the 31st floor of a law firm neither family had used before. Dana's choice, deliberately neutral ground. I walked in wearing a plain navy dress, no jewelry beyond my grandmother's ring. My daughter's 6 weeks old and safe with a sitter I trusted completely. And I sat down across from Julian, Charles, Margaret, and 2 attorneys whose hourly rates could have funded a small hospital wing, and I did not shake. Charles opened, as I'd expected he would, with an attempt to frame the entire matter as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by grief and hormones. A phrase he actually used, hormones, as though I were a teenager rather than the woman whose death his own son had discussed as a favorable liquidity event. Dana let him finish. She was very good at letting people finish digging. "Mr. Ashford," she said, once he had, "I have a recording, obtained legally and disclosed appropriately, in which your son describes, in his own words, withholding a life-saving medical intervention from his pregnant wife, specifically to preserve a favorable outcome under Section 4 of the Ashford Family Trust, contingent on either a male heir or, in the alternative, a Combrin, and I'm quoting directly here, clean transfer scenario resulting from her death. I also have documentation of a substantially increased life insurance policy taken out in the months following the trust's amendment, naming your son as sole beneficiary. I have receipts confirming your son's concurrent relationship with an employee of his own family's company, and confirmation that this relationship produced a son currently 11 weeks old. What I do not have, yet, is any indication that either of you, Margaret, Charles, We're unaware of any of this. Would either of you care to characterize your involvement differently before we proceed? The silence that followed was, I will admit, one of the most satisfying moments of my entire life. Margaret recovered first, her composure snapping back into place like a rubber band. You have no idea what you're threatening, young woman. The Ashford name has survived far worse than a disgruntled. Charles cut in before I could respond, his voice dropping into the register I imagined he used on underperforming board members. You should think very carefully before you threaten this family, Elena. We have resources you cannot begin to comprehend. Lawyers who will make whatever you think you have disappear into procedural noise for a decade. Is that really the life you want for those girls? Their mother locked in litigation until they're old enough to read about it themselves? Funny, Dana said before I had to, her tone almost pleasant. You'd bring up litigation history, Charles, because I did some reading on the Ashford Trust's provenance while preparing for this meeting. Your father's estate, Elena's father-in-law's father, for the room's benefit, spent 5 years in probate court after a very similar clause was contested by your sister, on grounds that a male heir requirement is, depending on jurisdiction and specific drafting, exactly the kind of provision courts have been increasingly willing to strike as against public policy. I have that filing. I also have this recording. I'm confident a judge would find the second considerably more interesting than the first, and I promise you, the discovery process alone would be a story your competitors and your board would enjoy reading about at length. So let's not talk about resources, Charles. Let's talk about exposure. You have a great deal of it. We have very little. Charles's jaw worked silently for a moment, the particular fury of a man unused to being outmaneuvered in his own conference room. Margaret's hand found his forearm, a small, tight gesture that looked, for the first time since I'd known her, less like control and more like fear. Margaret, I said, and something in my voice, steady, unhurried, utterly without fear, made her stop. I am not threatening the Ashford name. I am telling you, clearly, what happens next, and giving you the courtesy of a choice in how it happens, which is more courtesy than any of you extended to me. Here are my terms. I laid them out the way I'd laid out 100 product roadmaps in my career, clearly, in order, with no room for negotiation on the load-bearing points. Full custody of Genevieve and Isla, with supervised, pre-scheduled visitation for Julian and grandparents, contingent on continued good behavior and subject to review. My founder's equity in Meridian, already protected under the prenup, confirmed in writing as entirely mine, with no future claim from the Ashford Trust, regardless of any provision therein. A settlement figure Dana had calculated with a precision that made Charles's jaw visibly tighten. And, non-negotiably, full and permanent removal of my name and my daughter's names from any trust provision requiring a male heir or contingent on my death, present or future, along with a binding agreement that neither Julian nor his parents would ever contest custody, contest the settlement, or attempt to involve my daughters in any trust matter without my explicit written consent. And in exchange, I said, the recording, and everything that goes with it, stays sealed under the terms of this agreement, permanently, unless any of you violate its terms. I am not interested in destroying your family publicly. I am interested in making sure it never has the power to threaten mine again. Julian, who had said almost nothing through the entire exchange, finally spoke. Elena, I know I don't deserve to ask this, but will you ever let me actually know them? Not managed visits, just know them. I looked at him for a long moment. This man I had loved, genuinely, foolishly, completely, for 6 years, who had also, in the same breath, been capable of discussing my death as a story that generated goodwill. And I found, to my own surprise, that I felt something closer to grief than hatred. That depends entirely on the man you decide to be from here forward, I said. I'm not interested in erasing you from their lives out of spite. I'm interested in never again being someone whose life gets weighed against a spreadsheet. If you can prove, over years, not months, that you understand the difference, we'll talk. But it will be years, Julian. And it will be on my terms, in my house, on my schedule. Not because I'm punishing you. Because that's what safety looks like now. Charles, to his credit, or perhaps simply to his lawyer's credit, signed. Margaret signed with a hand that trembled with fury rather than remorse. Julian signed last, and something in the set of his shoulders as he did told me that whatever else was true about him, some part of him understood, finally, completely, the size of what he had lost. Renata Cole reached out 3 months later, through her own attorney, not to fight but to ask, with what I came to believe was genuine and hard-won humility, whether there was any way to keep her son separate from the wreckage of a family he hadn't chosen to be born into. I met her once, at her request, in a coffee shop far from anywhere either of the Ashfords frequented. She was younger than I expected and more tired, and I understood within 10 minutes of sitting across from her that she had been managed too, in her own way, promised things by a family that had never intended to deliver them, used as a contingency plan she hadn't fully understood herself until it was already in motion. I need you to know I didn't understand what I was part of, she said, turning a paper cup in slow circles without drinking from it. Julian told me you two were already essentially over, separated in every way that mattered, just waiting on paperwork and optics before an IPO you were both worried about. I know how that sounds now. I know I should have asked more questions. But I was 26, reporting to a man whose family's name is on buildings. And when he started paying attention to me, it felt less like an affair and more like, I don't know, being chosen. I didn't find out about the trust clause, the timing of it, any of it, until your lawyer's letter arrived. I threw up in my own bathroom when I read it. I want you to believe that, even though I understand you have no reason to. I believe you, I said, and found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did. For what it's worth, I don't think you were the architect of any of this. I think you were a tool his family reached for because you were convenient and young and didn't have the resources to ask the right questions before it was too late to walk away cleanly. That doesn't make what happened okay. It just means my anger was never really aimed at you specifically, even in the worst of it. She looked up at that, something in her face loosening slightly, the particular relief of a person bracing for a blow that doesn't land. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she said. I know what I was part of, even if I didn't know all of it at the time. I just don't want my son growing up in the middle of a war that isn't his. I've already told Julian's parents I won't be attending anything where the girls are present, unless you're comfortable with it. I meant that. He won't be caught in the middle, I told her, and meant it. Whatever else is true, that's not a fight I'm interested in having with a child. He didn't choose his father's family any more than my girls chose to be born into it either. We talked for another hour, longer than either of us had probably planned, about ordinary things eventually, sleep schedules, the particular exhaustion of a first year, the strange vertigo of realizing you'll be tied for the rest of your life to a family you'd give almost anything to be unconnected from. We didn't become friends, not in any way either of us pretended otherwise about, but we built something quieter and, in its way, more useful. An understanding between two women who had both, in different ways, been used by the same architecture of expectation, and who agreed, without much need for further discussion, that neither of our children would inherit that particular legacy, whatever else the two of us never fully resolved between ourselves. 6 months after the settlement, I stood at a podium in a converted warehouse space in Cambridge, in front of a room full of investors, journalists, and women who had spent their careers being told their ideas were niche, and launched the Halcyon Fund, $12 million drawn from my own settlement and equity, dedicated entirely to early-stage companies solving overlooked problems in maternal and reproductive health. A year ago, I told that room, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, I sat in the hospital room being told that a treatment that could save my life existed, and had existed for years, and had simply never been prioritized because the market that would have funded its development at scale didn't consider women's survival during pregnancy a sufficiently exciting return. I want to be very direct about what that means. It doesn't mean the science wasn't there. It means the capital wasn't. Because for decades, the people deciding where capital flows have quietly decided that half the population's medical crises are a niche market rather than a market. Full stop. I clicked to the next slide, a single, stark statistic about the share of venture funding directed toward women's health research. A number so small, it drew an audible sound from several people in the front rows. Today, that changes by exactly $12 million, and I intend to spend the rest of my career making sure that number keeps growing, rather than standing as a nice speech I gave once. Dr. Deepa Rao, whose research into affordable, scalable genetic screening had been quietly stalled for years for lack of funding interested in unsexy clinical infrastructure, took the stage after me, her voice shaking with something I recognized immediately, because I had felt it myself 6 months earlier in a different room, saying words that mattered instead of words that were expected of her. She described, in careful, technical language, occasionally softened by real emotion breaking through, a screening platform that could catch exactly the kind of rare, paired genetic marker that had nearly killed me. Not as an expensive boutique intervention, available only to families able to fund a $2 million therapy out of pocket, but as a standard, affordable panel any expectant mother, anywhere, could access. No mother's survival should be a function of her husband's net worth, she said, and the room, when it applauded, did so for a long, sustained moment that made my eyes sting in a way I hadn't fully prepared myself for. Afterward, 3 separate investors I didn't recognize approached me to ask how to get involved, and a woman near the back, introducing herself only as a labor and delivery nurse who'd driven up from Providence on her day off after reading about the launch, took both my hands in hers and said, simply, "Thank you for making this the headline instead of a footnote," and walked away before I could fully compose a response. Marin's piece, not the explosive exposé she could have written, but a careful, devastating profile of how trust structures and family governance quietly endanger women who marry into old money, built around anonymized details we'd agreed on together, ran the same week, and prompted, to my genuine surprise, 2 state legislative inquiries into medical disclosure practices at fertility clinics receiving major private donor funding. The Ashford name was never mentioned. It didn't need to be. Certain rooms in Boston understood exactly whose story it was. After the launch, the 4 of us, Dana had by then become as much a part of what Marin liked to call the Furies as any of us, though she pretended, unconvincingly, to find the nickname unprofessional, Ended up back at my kitchen table with a bottle of wine none of us finished, because between Dana's early flight and my own 6 a.m. feeding schedule, celebration these days tended to end well before midnight. To Elena, Marin said, raising her glass, who came to me with a burner phone and a notebook full of receipts and turned it into an actual reckoning. To Priya, I said, who kept me from getting caught roughly 40 times before any of us knew what we were building. To Dana, Priya added, for making clean transfer scenario the most expensive 4 words in Massachusetts family law. To all of us, Dana said, quieter than her usual courtroom cadence, for believing a scared, pregnant woman with a stolen phone and a scarf she never actually needed back. We laughed longer than the joke deserved, the particular laughter of people who have been through something together and survived it. And I looked around that table, at these 3 women who had shown up for a stranger's crisis with skill and precision and a fierceness that still, months later, moved me nearly to tears when I let myself sit with it, and thought about how differently this story could have ended if I hadn't had somewhere to bring it. I think about that often now. I think about the women who don't have a Marin, a Priya, a Dana, who overhear the same kind of conversation in the same kind of hallway and have nowhere to take it back into the marriage that produced it. Part of why I agreed to let any of this be written down at all, even in this careful, changed detail way, is for them. The girls turned one on a bright, unremarkable Saturday in June, and I threw them a party that involved considerably more smashed cake than dignity, in a backyard strung with the kind of cheap paper lanterns Margaret would have found beneath consideration. Renata came, briefly, with her son, a decision I'd thought carefully about and ultimately made because I believed, and still believe, that children should not inherit the battle lines their parents drew before they were born. She stayed 40 minutes, watched her son and my daughters regard each other with the frank, unbothered curiosity of toddlers who understand nothing yet of what connects them, and left with an expression I recognized, because I'd worn it myself not so long before. The particular relief of a woman discovering that the life on the other side of catastrophe can still, against every reasonable expectation, contain ordinary, unremarkable joy. Julian came too, for the agreed hour supervised as the settlement required, and knelt in the grass while Isla solemnly handed him a fistful of smashed cake as though bestowing a great honor. I watched him from the porch, laughing despite himself, careful and gentle in exactly the way that had once made me believe, completely, that he'd make an extraordinary father. He has, in the 18 months since the settlement, kept every term of our agreement without complaint or maneuvering, has not contested a single visitation schedule, has not once tried to involve his parents in a decision that wasn't his to make alone, has shown up, consistently, changed in ways that are slow and unglamorous and, as far as I can tell, genuine. I don't know yet what to make of that. I've stopped needing to know right away. Dana's advice, the day we signed the settlement, has stayed with me. You don't owe anyone a verdict on their redemption before the evidence is in. Take the years. Watch what they do with them. Margaret and Charles were not invited and did not ask to be. I understand, from the occasional oblique mention in Julian's updates, that the Ashford Trust has since been quietly restructured, the male heir provision removed. Whether from genuine reckoning or simple risk management, I have no way of knowing, and increasingly, no real interest in finding out. Some fights, once won, are worth setting down entirely rather than carrying forward out of habit. Theo and I had our first real dinner, not coffee, dinner, with an actual reservation and an actual babysitter, 4 months after that first text about the Globe piece. He didn't ask about the Ashfords, didn't seem to need the full architecture of what had happened to know that I was, in some fundamental way, still assembling myself back into a person who trusted easily. He asked about the girl's favorite books instead, and told me, with an easy, unhurried honesty I'd forgotten men were capable of, about his own complicated family, his own slow work of learning which inherited patterns were worth keeping and which needed to be set down. "I'm not in a hurry for anything," he told me, over a dessert we split without either of us performing reluctance about it. "I just like being around you. Whatever pace that ends up moving at is fine by me." It was, I realized somewhere around the third date, the first relationship of my adult life that had never once asked me to manage myself smaller to fit inside it. 2 years out from that afternoon in the clinic hallway, I no longer flinch at the sound of a phone buzzing unexpectedly, which is a smaller victory than it sounds like and took a great deal longer to earn than I would have guessed. The girls are walking now, in the determined, top-heavy way of toddlers who have only recently discovered that the ground can be argued with. And Genevieve has developed a habit of narrating her own actions in a stream of increasingly confident sentences that Theo, who is around often enough now that the girls have started asking for him by name on the mornings he isn't, finds endlessly delighted by. Halcyon has funded 11 companies in its first 18 months, 3 of which have gone on to raise significant follow-on rounds from investors who, 6 years ago, would never have looked twice at women's health on a pitch deck without some more palatable euphemism attached. Dr. Rao's screening platform is now in early pilot programs at 4 hospital systems across New England, including, in a detail I still find quietly, fiercely satisfying, one that sits 2 floors above the very fertility clinic where I once stood frozen outside a half-closed door. Meridian went public that spring, and my 14%, protected all those years ago by a single clause a friend of a friend lawyer had insisted on adding to a document I had barely read at the time, became a number large enough that I no longer think about money the way I once had to. Not out of luxury exactly, but out of the particular, hard-won freedom of never again needing anyone's permission or approval to leave a room, a marriage, or a life that no longer served me. Julian and I speak now, mostly about logistics, occasionally about something closer to the easy, uncomplicated conversation we used to have before any of this. A shared observation about one of the girls, a scheduling question navigated without an edge to it. I don't know what to call what remains between us. Not friendship, not quite. Something more like the careful, permanent architecture 2 people build when they've been through a war together, on opposite sides of it, and have both decided, separately, that peace is worth more than being right about who started it. That evening, back in the house I'd bought entirely with my own name on the deed, I sat on the floor of the nursery while Genevieve and Isla, 8 months old now, batted at a mobile of paper cranes Priya had made them, and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel fully in almost a year. Peace. Not the fragile, performed kind I'd worn like a coat through the pregnancy, but the real thing, earned rather than assumed. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't immediately recognize, though the area code, Vermont, placed it before the name did. "Saw the piece in the Globe today. Didn't need your name in it to know exactly whose courage that was. The girls are lucky. Theo." Theo, a pediatric occupational therapist I'd met at a park bench 11 weeks earlier, who had asked about the twins and not about the very obvious absence of a husband, who had given me his number and told me, without a flicker of expectation in his voice, that coffee was on the table whenever, if ever, I wanted it, and hadn't been offended when months went by and I didn't call. I looked at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Thank you. still figuring it all out, some days more than others. His reply came fast. "Aren't we all? No expiry date on that coffee." I set the phone down, a small, unfamiliar warmth blooming in my chest. Not a plan, not yet, just a possibility. The first one I'd let myself hold in a very long time that wasn't about survival. On the coffee table that evening, among the bills and catalogs, sat a stiff cream envelope, the return address the Whitmore estate. I opened it. Not a lawyer's letter, a note in Margaret's precise, furious hand. "You have taken everything that mattered and dressed it up as virtue. Blood tells in the end. They are Ashfords, whatever name you've given them. That truth will find them, and you, eventually." I read it twice. Then I walked to the fireplace, held the corner of the paper to the flame, and watched it curl and blacken and disappear. She was wrong. My daughters were not Ashfords. They were Marshes. My name, reclaimed the week the divorce finalized, worn now the way a name should be worn, because it was mine and I had chosen it, not because it had been assigned to me by someone else's architecture. Their inheritance would be a story of a mother who found the floor giving way beneath her and built something sturdier in its place, not a story of a legacy that required anyone's death to continue. I looked at my daughters, their faces soft with a particular concentration of babies discovering their own hands, and I thought about the woman I'd been 11 months earlier, frozen in a hallway, one hand pressed to a wall, listening to her own death get discussed in the careful, upholstered language of people who had never once imagined she might be listening. That woman was gone, not erased, transformed, the way anything is transformed by fire, smaller in some ways, harder in most, but entirely, finally, her own. The war was over. The peace, whatever shape it eventually took, was mine to define. I was no longer Elena Ashford, the wife being managed. I was Elena Marsh, mother, founder, and, for the first time in longer than I could remember, entirely, unmanageably free. People sometimes ask me now, when enough time and distance make the question feel askable, whether I regret staying silent that first day in the clinic hallway, whether I wish I'd thrown the door open right then, screamed, demanded an explanation on the spot. I understand the impulse behind the question. There's a version of this story that would have felt more cinematic told that way, more immediately righteous. But I don't regret the silence. I've come to believe the silence was the single most important decision I made in the entire ordeal, because it bought me the only thing that ever actually protects a person in a fight like that: time and information gathered calmly before the other side knew there was a fight underway at all. Rage feels like power in the moment. It rarely is. What was actually powerful was a woman standing very still in a hallway, choosing, deliberately, not to hand her enemy a single second of warning. If you are reading this because some detail in it landed too close to your own life, a family that manages you and calls it love, a partner whose devotion seems to run alongside something colder you can't quite name, a growing sense that your own instincts are being carefully, patiently talked out of you. I want to say the thing I most needed to hear during those months and had no one to say it to me directly. Your discomfort is data, not a character flaw. The version of you that notices the wrongness of a phrase like manage this or concierge service or the file is not being paranoid. She is the only part of you still looking clearly. Protect her. Feed her information instead of reassurance. She will, if you let her, save your life. I don't know what happens to the Ashford name in another 30 years. I don't spend much time wondering. I know what happens to mine. Genevieve and Isla will grow up understanding that their inheritance was not a clause in someone else's document, but a mother who found the floor giving way and, instead of falling through it, built something of her own to stand on. That story, unlike the one that was almost written for me, belongs entirely to us. Game on, I told my reflection, all those months ago in a parked car outside a fertility clinic, to two lives I hadn't yet met and already would have burned the whole world down to protect. I won. Not the way anyone expected, not the way that made for the cleanest headline, but I won, and I am still, every ordinary morning since, winning it again. Some mornings that looks like a boardroom, and some mornings it looks like nothing more dramatic than getting two overtired toddlers into matching shoes before daycare. And I've stopped needing either version to feel more significant than the other. Because I understand now, in a way I didn't at 33, that the real victory was never the recording, or the settlement, or the fund with my name quietly behind it. The real victory was smaller and larger than all of that at once. It was simply this: I am, finally, the one who decides what my own life is worth. And no document, no family, no hallway will ever again get to make that determination without me in the room.